The records didn't lie, but someone had been lying to them for decades. Margaret Hayes pulled another dusty ledger from the storage room shelf, her fingers leaving clean tracks through years of accumulated grime. The basement of Charleston County's records office smelled like mildew and forgotten secrets, a scent she'd grown accustomed to since accepting this position in March 1951. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting unstable shadows across rows of metal filing cabinets that stretched toward the far wall like iron soldiers guarding something no one wanted to remember. As the county's new chief archivist, her job was simple: organize 40 years of birth certificates, death records, and hospital documentation into something resembling order. Make sense of the chaos. Create a system. The previous archivist, an elderly man named Mr. Thornton, had retired after 32 years of service, leaving behind what could only be described as organized chaos. Files were misfiled, documents were scattered across different cabinets with no apparent logic, and some boxes hadn't been opened since they were first stored in the 1920s. Simple. That's what County Administrator Howard Brennan had told her during the interview. Just needs someone with attention to detail and patience, nothing complicated. Margaret had believed him. She'd needed the job. Her father's medical bills from his final illness had depleted her savings, and her previous position at the Columbia Municipal Library had ended when budget cuts eliminated her department. Charleston offered stability, decent pay, and the kind of quiet, methodical work that suited her temperament. The ledger in her hands was from 1927, its leather binding cracked with age and exposure to the basement's humidity. She carried it to her desk, a scarred wooden thing that had probably been down here as long as the files, and opened it carefully, revealing page after page of birth records written in neat, administrative handwriting. Names, dates, times of birth, mothers listed, fathers listed, race listed. This was South Carolina in the 1920s, after all, where such classifications were considered essential information. The usual documentation, meticulously recorded, except when it wasn't. Margaret's pen hovered over her notepad as she reached an entry that gave her pause. Baby listed as female European descent. Mother's name, blank. Father's name, blank. Place of birth, Charleston Foundling Home. Adopted, yes, within 3 days of birth. Adoptive family, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Prescott of 47 Battery Street. Battery Street. That was old money territory, the kind of address that meant the Prescott family had been wealthy for generations. She made a note and continued. 2 pages later, another similar entry. Baby male, European descent, no parents listed. Born at Charleston Foundling Home, adopted within 48 hours by Mr. and Mrs. William Beaumont. Margaret frowned. She'd worked in municipal records for nearly 8 years before coming to Charleston, first in Columbia, then briefly in Greenville. She'd seen plenty of incomplete paperwork, plenty of administrative shortcuts taken by overworked clerks. Orphanages and foundling homes often received babies whose mothers wanted to remain anonymous. That part wasn't unusual, but something about these entries felt different. The blank spaces were too consistent, too deliberate. Most foundling home records at least included some information. Mother wishes to remain anonymous, or abandoned at location, or something to indicate the circumstances. These entries were aggressively blank, as though someone had carefully erased any trace of origin. She flipped back through the pages she'd just catalogued. There was another one on page 17, and another on page 23. Baby after baby, all marked as European, all with missing parental information, all adopted within days of arrival, always to wealthy families, always to addresses in the nicest parts of Charleston. Margaret lit a cigarette, her third of the morning, and stared at the ledger. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe foundling homes in the 1920s just kept poor records. Maybe wealthy families had some kind of fast-track adoption process she wasn't aware of. But her instincts, honed by years of catching clerical errors and inconsistencies, told her this was something else entirely. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret worked her way through 16 years of records, from 1922 through 1938. She established a routine. Arrive at 7 in the morning before the rest of the administrative staff, make coffee in the small break room, and descend into the basement with her notepad and a fresh pack of cigarettes. She'd work until noon, take a brief lunch at her desk, then continue until 5 or sometimes 6 in the evening. The pattern didn't just continue, it intensified. Between 1923 and 1939, she counted 147 babies that matched the same profile, listed as white or European, no parents recorded, placed through either the Charleston Foundling Home or a private organization called St. Catherine's Adoption Society. All adopted quickly, most within a week of their appearance in the system. All to wealthy families. What made Margaret's stomach turn wasn't just the missing information. It was what she found when she started cross-referencing these cases with hospital admission records from the same time period. The Charleston County Hospital kept meticulous records of every admission. Patient name, race, reason for admission, attending physician, date of admission, date of discharge. Margaret had been organizing these records as part of her archival work, boxing them by year and creating an index system. She'd been treating it as routine paperwork until she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in late April, Margaret spread 17 documents across her desk in the empty records room. She'd sent her assistant, a young woman named Betty who helped with filing 3 days a week, home early with a claimed headache. She needed to be alone for this. Birth certificate on the left. Baby Catherine, European, no parents listed. Born March 14, 1931, adopted through St. Catherine's Adoption Society on March 17, 1931. Adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Cunningham of South Battery Street. Hospital admission record on the right. Evelyn Porter, Negro, age 24, admitted for childbirth March 14, 1931, delivered a girl at 3:47 a.m., discharged March 16, 1931 without child. Attending physician Dr. Harrison Webb. The dates matched perfectly. The hospital was the same. But according to official records, these were 2 completely different events that just happened to occur at the exact same time, in the exact same place. Baby Catherine had no mother. Evelyn Porter had no baby. Margaret's hands trembled as she lit another cigarette. She laid out another set of documents. Birth certificate. Baby James, European descent. No parents listed. Born August 3, 1928 at Charleston County Hospital. Adopted August 6, 1928 by Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Ashford. Hospital record. Ruth Ann Jackson, Negro, age 19, admitted for childbirth August 2, 1928, delivered a boy August 3 at 11:23 p.m., discharged August 5 without child. Attending physician, Dr. Harrison Webb. Another perfect match. Different mothers, different babies, but the same impossible coincidence. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon matching records. By the time darkness fell and she was working by the dim light of her desk lamp, she had 17 matched sets. 17 babies who officially had no mothers, born to mothers who officially had no babies. The dates aligned, the locations aligned. The only thing that didn't align was the race listed on the documents. The mothers were all listed as Negro or colored. The babies were all listed as European or white, and every single case involved Dr. Harrison Webb. Margaret stubbed out her cigarette in an overflowing ashtray and stared at the documents spread before her like evidence at a crime scene. Because that's what this was, she realized with growing horror. This wasn't administrative error or clerical confusion. This was systematic. This was organized. This was deliberate. Someone had been taking babies from black mothers and selling them as white. She should report this immediately to her supervisor, she knew. Howard Brennan was a reasonable man, a fair administrator. Surely he would see what she was seeing, understand the implications, and take appropriate action. This was evidence of crimes, kidnapping, fraud, falsification of official documents, serious crimes that demanded investigation. But something held her back. The meticulous nature of the deception suggested this wasn't the work of one rogue clerk or even one corrupt doctor. This required coordination between multiple institutions: the hospital, the foundling home, St. Catherine's Adoption Society, and whoever processed the birth certificates and adoption papers. It required authority, respect, and the cooperation of people at multiple levels of Charleston's social and administrative hierarchy. Dr. Harrison Webb's name appeared on every single matched hospital record. That couldn't be coincidence, but Webb wasn't just any doctor. Margaret had seen his name on plaques and dedication ceremonies mentioned in old newspapers she'd catalogued. He'd been prominent, respected, influential, the kind of man whose word carried weight. Whoever had orchestrated this operation had power, and powerful people protected themselves and each other. Margaret decided to dig deeper before reporting anything. She needed more than matched documents and suspicious coincidences. She needed to understand the scope, the mechanism, the money trail. She needed evidence so compelling that it couldn't be dismissed or buried. She began staying later at the office, arriving earlier. Betty commented that Mrs. Hayes seemed very dedicated to her work. Mr. Brennan, on his occasional visits to check on the archiving progress, seemed pleased with her thoroughness. Neither of them knew what she was really doing. Margaret created a hidden filing system in the locked bottom drawer of her desk. For every matched case she found, she made careful notes. Mother's name and address, baby's listed information, adoptive family name and address, attending physician, dates. She noted patterns, repeated names, connections between families. She started mapping the network on sheets of paper she kept folded at the bottom of her purse. The Charleston foundling home had closed in 1943, its building now converted into apartments. Margaret drove past it one evening after work, a 3-story brick building on Ashley Avenue, unremarkable except for the small plaque by the door indicating its former purpose. She wondered how many babies had been processed through those doors, how many mothers had handed over children they couldn't keep, how many had been told their babies were dead when they were actually being prepared for sale. But St. Catherine's Adoption Society was still operating, housed in a respectable-looking brick building on King Street, right in the heart of Charleston's commercial district. Margaret had walked past it 100 times without thinking twice. It looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a charitable organization helping children find homes. She went there on a Saturday morning in early May, dressed in her best church clothes, a navy blue dress with white collar, modest heels, a hat she normally reserved for weddings. She'd rehearsed her story carefully, practicing in front of her bathroom mirror until the lies came smoothly. The building's interior was clean and professional, with tile floors and painted walls covered in framed photographs of smiling children. A reception desk dominated the front room, behind which sat a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair styled in perfect waves. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, Administrative Director. "Good morning," Margaret said, keeping her voice pleasant and slightly uncertain, the tone of someone who wasn't quite sure they were in the right place. "I'm hoping you might be able to help me. I'm trying to locate information about an adoption that may have gone through St. Catherine's." Mrs. Pritchard's smile was immediate and professional, but Margaret noticed it didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, dear. We're always happy to help with inquiries. What sort of information are you seeking?" "It's about my cousin," Margaret said, using the cover story she'd prepared. "She was adopted as an infant in 1932. Our grandmother recently passed and left a small inheritance to all her grandchildren. We're trying to locate Catherine, that's my cousin, to notify her of the inheritance. The family always knew she was adopted, but we never knew through which agency." "I see." Mrs. Pritchard pulled out a ledger from beneath the desk. "And what was the adoptive family's name?" "Cunningham. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Cunningham. They lived on South Battery Street." Something flickered across Mrs. Pritchard's face, so quick Margaret almost missed it. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. "I'm afraid our records are confidential, dear. Mrs. Pritchard said, closing the ledger without looking at it. Adoption files are sealed for the protection of all parties involved. It's state law. I'm sure you understand. Of course, I do understand the need for privacy, but this is a legal matter, an inheritance. Surely there's some way to at least confirm whether the adoption went through your agency. I'm not asking for details about her birth family or anything sensitive. The law is quite clear. Mrs. Pritchard's smile had frozen into something less friendly. We cannot confirm or deny any adoption without proper legal authorization, a court order, or written permission from the adoptee themselves. If your cousin wishes to learn about her adoption, she would need to petition the court to unseal the records. But how can she petition if we can't even locate her to tell her about the inheritance? That's unfortunate, but I'm afraid it doesn't change the legal requirements. Mrs. Pritchard stood, indicating the conversation was over. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful. Have you tried hiring a private investigator? They often have resources for locating missing family members. Margaret thanked her and left, her mind racing. The woman's reaction had been too smooth, too practiced. This wasn't standard bureaucratic adherence to privacy laws. This was a wall specifically built to keep people from asking questions. Mrs. Pritchard had recognized the Cunningham name. Margaret was certain of it, and she'd shut down the inquiry with practiced efficiency. Over the following weeks, Margaret continued her research with increasing caution. She varied her routine, sometimes arriving late instead of early, sometimes working through lunch, sometimes leaving at exactly 5 o'clock like a normal employee. She didn't want to establish a pattern that might draw attention. She created a second set of notes that she kept at home, hidden in a hatbox at the back of her bedroom closet. If someone confiscated her work files, she'd still have a backup. She was beginning to understand she was investigating something that powerful people wanted to stay buried. The count of matched cases grew steadily. 147 became 163, then 184, then 207. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Margaret started analyzing the adoptive families more carefully, looking for patterns beyond just wealth. She pulled property records, cross-referenced social announcements in old newspapers, traced family connections through marriage records and business partnerships. The families formed an interconnected web of Charleston's elite. Prescott's married Beaumonts. Cunninghams went into business with Ashfords. They belonged to the same country clubs, attended the same Episcopal churches, sent their children to the same private schools. They served on the same boards of directors, supported the same political candidates, socialized at the same exclusive gatherings, and they'd all adopted babies through either the Charleston Foundling Home or St. Catherine's Adoption Society during roughly the same 2-decade period. Babies with no documented parents, babies that appeared in the system as cleanly white, babies that could be absorbed into these wealthy white families without raising questions. In early June, Margaret made a discovery that transformed her understanding of the operation's financial structure. She was reviewing old financial records from Charleston County Hospital, dusty ledgers that documented every payment in and out of the institution, when she found a series of entries that didn't make sense. Regular payments to something called the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau. Substantial payments, $500 here, $800 there, sometimes over $1,000. All annotated vaguely. Welfare services rendered, child placement administrative costs, bureau consultation fees. Margaret had never heard of the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau. Despite having catalogued thousands of documents related to child welfare services, orphanages, and charitable organizations operating in South Carolina during the 1920s and 1930s. She spent 2 days tracking the organization through business registration records filed with the state. The Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau had been established in 1922 and dissolved in 1940. Its registered address was the same building that housed St. Catherine's Adoption Society. Its founder and sole director, Dr. Harrison Webb. Dr. Harrison Webb, the pediatrician whose name appeared on every single matched hospital admission record. Dr. Harrison Webb, who'd been a prominent citizen, a respected doctor, a beloved community figure. Dr. Harrison Webb, who'd apparently been running a private organization that received substantial payments from a public hospital for vaguely defined welfare services. Margaret pulled every financial record she could find related to the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau. The hospital payments were just the beginning. She found payments from Charleston County's Child Welfare Department, payments from private individuals, wealthy individuals with familiar names, payments listed as donations or charitable contributions or adoption facilitation fees. Over 18 years, the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau had received over $300,000. In 1920s and 1930s dollars, that was a fortune, and it had all flowed through Dr. Harrison Webb. Margaret found Webb's obituary in the Charleston Post archives. It painted the picture of a man who dedicated his life to improving conditions for disadvantaged children. He'd established Charleston's first pediatric clinic. He'd served on the boards of multiple charitable organizations. He'd advocated for better nutrition programs for poor children. He'd been married for 40 years, had 3 children of his own, was a deacon in his church. The obituary described him as a pillar of the Charleston medical community whose compassion and dedication improved the lives of countless children who might otherwise have been forgotten by society. Donations in his memory were directed to St. Catherine's Adoption Society. Dr. Webb had died in 1945, praised and respected, his legacy celebrated. 6 years later, Margaret was uncovering evidence that his charitable work had been a cover for systematic child trafficking. The pieces were assembling into a horrifying picture. Webb had used his position as a respected pediatrician to identify light-skinned babies born to black mothers, women who were poor, often unmarried, legally and socially powerless. Through his role at the hospital, he could control what information went onto birth certificates and hospital records. Through the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau and his connection to St. Catherine's, he could facilitate adoptions. Through his reputation and social connections, he could connect these babies with wealthy white families desperate for children. The black mothers were told their babies had died or were taken immediately after birth with vague explanations. No bodies were shown, no death certificates were issued. The women, devastated and legally powerless, had no recourse. Who would believe a poor black woman accusing a respected white doctor? The babies were documented as white or European from birth, erasing any paper trail connecting them to their biological mothers. With no record of black parentage, there was no legal claim to be made, no connection to be traced. The wealthy white families got healthy infants without the difficulties and expenses of traditional adoption. They paid substantial fees, disguised as donations to the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau or St. Catherine's Adoption Society, and received babies who could pass as their biological children. In an era before blood testing or DNA analysis, there was no way to prove the children weren't related to their adoptive families. Everyone got what they wanted, except the mothers, who got loss and lies and decades of unanswered questions. It was elegant in its cruelty. It was efficient in its exploitation, and it had operated for nearly 20 years, protected by medical authority, social respectability, and the racial hierarchies that made black women's testimony worthless against white institutions. Margaret knew she needed more than documents. She needed testimony. She needed to talk to the mothers. This was dangerous territory, and Margaret knew it. She was a white woman planning to go into black neighborhoods and ask about events that had occurred decades ago, events that, if her theory was correct, involved powerful white institutions stealing children from vulnerable black women. She had no authority, no official reason to be asking questions, no protection if the wrong people found out what she was investigating. But she had to know. The documents told part of the story, but they were cold, impersonal. The mothers could tell her what had really happened, could confirm or disprove her theories, could add the human dimension that would make this undeniable. She started with Evelyn Porter, whose hospital admission had matched baby Catherine's birth certificate from 1931. The hospital record listed an address on Cumming Street, a historically black neighborhood just north of downtown Charleston. Margaret drove there on a Saturday afternoon in mid-June. Cumming Street was lined with narrow houses painted in faded colors, porches where people sat fanning themselves in the heat, children playing on sidewalks. Margaret's car, a blue Ford sedan, drew stares. White women didn't often drive through this neighborhood, especially not alone. The address from the 1931 hospital record led to a narrow two-story house with peeling yellow paint and a sagging front porch. A garden in the tiny front yard grew tomatoes and beans on makeshift trellises. An elderly man sat on the porch in a rocking chair, watching Margaret approach with undisguised suspicion. "Afternoon," Margaret said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. "I'm looking for Evelyn Porter. I understand she lived at this address back in the 1930s. The man stopped rocking. His face was deeply lined, his hair white. He studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking. "Who's asking?" "My name is Margaret Hayes. I work for Charleston County's records office." She'd decided partial honesty was safest. "I'm trying to locate some old hospital records, and Evelyn Porter's name came up. I'm trying to verify information from 1931. Evelyn's been dead near 10 years now," the man said flatly. "What's this about?" Margaret hesitated. She couldn't tell him the full truth. Not yet. Not without knowing who he was or whether he could be trusted. "I found some incomplete information in old hospital records. I'm trying to make sure everything's properly documented. It's routine archival work. Did you know Evelyn?" "She was my sister." His expression hardened. "And there wasn't nothing routine about what happened to her in 1931. So why don't you tell me what you're really here for?" Margaret made a decision. She climbed the porch steps slowly, carefully, making sure he could see she wasn't a threat. "May I sit?" He gestured to a wooden chair. Margaret sat, placed her purse in her lap, and chose her words carefully. "I've been organizing old county records," she said. "Hospital admissions, birth certificates, adoption papers. While doing that work, I found inconsistencies, patterns that don't make sense. Women admitted to the hospital for childbirth who were discharged without babies, but no death certificates exist for those babies. At the same time, babies with no recorded mothers being adopted through Charleston agencies." She met his eyes. "I think something wrong happened. I think babies were taken from their mothers, and those mothers were told the babies died. I'm trying to find out if I'm right." The man studied her face for a long time. The only sound was the creak of his rocking chair and the distant laughter of children playing. "You ain't from around here," he finally said. "Your accent's got a little too much Columbia in it." "I'm from Columbia originally. I moved to Charleston for this job 5 months ago. So you don't know how things work here. You don't know what happens to people who ask the wrong questions about the wrong things." He leaned forward. "My sister Evelyn went into Charleston County Hospital in March of 1931, 9 months pregnant. She wasn't married. The father was a white man who worked at the port, denied everything. But Evelyn was happy about the baby anyway. She had a name picked out, had clothes ready, had plans." He paused, his jaw working. "She went into that hospital expecting to come home with her daughter. They told her the baby died during delivery. Complications, they said. Better this way, they said. The Lord works in mysterious ways, they said." "Did she believe them?" Margaret asked quietly. "What choice did she have? They were doctors, white doctors. She was a black woman with no husband and no money. When she asked to see the body, they told her it wasn't possible. Said the baby's body had already been prepared for burial. Said it would be too upsetting, better for her to remember the pregnancy instead of seeing death." He shook his head. "They didn't even give her a grave location, said the hospital took care of indigent burials. But she didn't believe them. She knew her baby hadn't died. She told me late at night when she'd been drinking and the memories got too heavy, that she heard her baby crying. Heard her for maybe 10 seconds after the birth. Heard a strong, healthy cry. Then a nurse took the baby away and Evelyn never saw her again. They told her she'd imagined the crying, that she was confused from the pain medication. His voice dropped. But dead babies don't cry, Miss Hayes. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Did she ever try to find out what happened? She tried. She went back to the hospital 2 weeks later, demanded to see records, demanded to know where her baby was buried. They had her arrested for causing a disturbance. She spent 3 nights in jail. When she got out, 2 white men came to the boarding house where she was living. Told her if she kept asking questions, she'd find herself in the state asylum. Said they had doctors who would testify she was mentally unstable, a danger to herself and others. He looked directly at Margaret. She stopped asking questions after that. Fear'll do that to a person. What was the doctor's name? Margaret asked, though she already knew. The one who delivered her baby? Webb. Dr. Harrison Webb. Everyone said he was a good man, a kind man. Evelyn died still wondering why a good man would lie to her like that. Margaret thanked him and returned to her car with trembling legs. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This wasn't just theoretical crime reconstructed from dusty documents. This was real. These were real children torn from their mother's arms, real women who'd spent decades grieving for losses they'd been told were inevitable, but which were actually calculated theft. She had a name now, Evelyn Porter. She had testimony from Evelyn's brother. But one case wasn't enough. She needed more. Over the next 6 weeks, Margaret systematically tracked down families connected to her matched records. It was painstaking, difficult work. Many of the addresses from the 1920s and 1930s no longer existed. Many of the people involved were dead. But Charleston's black community had long memories, and families tended to stay in the same neighborhoods across generations. She found Ruth Ann Jackson's cousin in a barbershop on Spring Street. The cousin, a man in his 50s named James, remembered Ruth Ann talking about the baby she'd lost. She said he was the prettiest baby she'd ever seen. James told Margaret quietly, after she'd explained why she was asking questions. Light-skinned, with soft curls. She got to hold him for maybe 5 minutes before a nurse took him away. They told her he had trouble breathing, needed special care. Next thing she knew, they were telling her he'd died. She never saw him again. Never got a body. Never got closure. Margaret found Clara Williams still alive, living with her daughter's family in a small house on Nassau Street. Clara was 73, her body bent with arthritis, but her mind was sharp as ever. She invited Margaret inside with a wariness that melted into fierce anger when Margaret explained her research. "They stole my son," Clara said flatly. She sat in a worn armchair, her gnarled hands gripping the armrests. "They told me he died, but I knew better. I saw him. He was breathing. He was alive. And then they took him away and told me lies." "What happened when you questioned them?" Margaret asked gently. Clara's laugh was bitter. "I made a fuss. I demanded answers. I went to that hospital every day for a week, asking where my son was buried, asking to see death certificates, asking why no one could give me straight answers." She paused. "They had me committed to the state asylum. Said I was having a mental breakdown, that the grief had made me unstable. I spent 6 months in that place. 6 months? 6 months of hell. And when they finally let me out, I found out they'd done something else while I was locked up." Clara's voice shook. "They sterilized me. Said it was medically necessary. Said I'd had complications during my son's birth that required surgery. But I know what they really did. They made sure I'd never have another baby they could take." Margaret felt sick. "Did you ever try to pursue legal action? With what lawyer? What money? I was a black woman who'd been declared mentally unstable by white doctors. Who was going to believe me?" Clara leaned forward. "You know what the worst part was? I'd see them sometimes, those white families with their new babies, walking downtown, shopping on King Street, and I'd look at those babies and wonder if one of them was mine. Wonder if my son was being raised 10 blocks away by people who had no idea he'd been stolen." Margaret interviewed 7 more mothers, or their surviving family members, over the next month. The stories were hauntingly similar. Babies described as unusually light-skinned, taken away immediately after birth or within the first few hours. Mothers told their children had died, but never shown bodies, never given death certificates, never provided with any documentation of death or burial. Women who questioned too loudly faced consequences: arrest, institutionalization, threats, loss of employment. One woman, Dorothy Lewis, had been fired from her job as a domestic worker when her employer, a wealthy white family, learned she was making accusations about the hospital. Dorothy's employer happened to be on the board of Charleston County Hospital. Another woman, Helen Brown, had been visited by police who'd threatened her with arrest for filing a false report when she tried to claim her supposedly dead baby was actually alive. The system had protected itself efficiently. Any mother who resisted was quickly silenced through legal intimidation, social pressure, or institutionalization. The racial dynamics of 1920s and 1930s South Carolina meant that black women's testimony carried no weight against white medical professionals' word. The mothers were poor, often unmarried, legally powerless. The institutions were wealthy, respectable, protected by Charleston's elite. It had been perfect, and it had been perfectly evil. Margaret compiled everything she'd learned into detailed notes. She now had documentary evidence, matched birth certificates and hospital records. She had financial records showing payments flowing through Dr. Webb's organization. She had testimony from multiple mothers and family members describing the same pattern of behavior. She had a clear picture of how the operation had functioned. Identify light-skinned babies born to black mothers. Take the babies immediately after birth. Tell the mothers the babies died. Falsify birth certificates to list the babies as white with no parents. Sell the babies to wealthy white families through adoption agencies, and silence any mother who asked too many questions. 207 cases. That was her current count. 207 babies stolen and sold over 18 years. The scope was staggering. This wasn't the work of one corrupt doctor acting alone. This required a network. Hospital administrators who allowed false documentation, nurses who took babies from their mothers, adoption agency staff who processed fraudulent papers, clerks who filed birth certificates they knew were lies, police who intimidated mothers into silence, judges who committed women to asylums for asking questions. And all of it had operated openly, protected by respectability and racial hierarchy, for nearly 2 decades. Margaret knew she had to report this to someone with authority to investigate and prosecute. But who? The hospital administration was clearly implicated. Payments to Webb's organization had come from hospital funds, and hospital staff had participated in taking babies and falsifying records. St. Catherine's Adoption Society was central to the operation. Even the police couldn't be trusted. They'd arrested mothers who demanded answers. She needed someone outside Charleston's power structure. Someone who couldn't be pressured or bought. Someone who would take this seriously. She decided to approach a lawyer named Thomas Griffin, whose office was on Broad Street, and who had a reputation for taking on controversial cases. She'd read about him in newspaper archives. He'd defended a black man accused of theft who'd been beaten by police, had challenged discriminatory practices at a local textile mill, had generally established himself as someone willing to stand against Charleston's establishment when justice demanded it. She called his office and made an appointment, telling his secretary only that she had information about official records that required legal expertise. Griffin's office was in a narrow building sandwiched between a bank and a real estate agency. The waiting room was small but clean, the furniture modest. A secretary with kind eyes showed Margaret into Griffin's private office at precisely 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in late July. Thomas Griffin was a thin man in his 50s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair that was thinning at the crown. He stood to shake Margaret's hand, his grip firm and brief. "Miss Hayes, my secretary said you have information about official records that might require legal consultation." Margaret had brought a briefcase containing selected documents. She wasn't foolish enough to bring everything, not to a first meeting. She opened it and pulled out a folder. "Mr. Griffin, I'm the chief archivist for Charleston County. Over the past 4 months, I've been organizing historical records as part of my job. During that work, I discovered evidence of what I believe was systematic fraud, kidnapping, and trafficking of infants. She placed the folder on his desk. I need to know what legal options exist for reporting and investigating these crimes. Griffin's eyebrows rose. He opened the folder and began examining the documents Margaret had selected. 3 matched sets of birth certificates and hospital records, financial records showing payments to the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, notes from her interviews with Clara Williams and Evelyn Porter's brother. He read in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Margaret watched his expression shift from skepticism to attention to something like dismay. "These dates are from the 1920s and 1930s, he finally said. "Yes. The operation appears to have run from approximately 1922 to 1940. And you're alleging that Dr. Harrison Webb—" He looked up at her. "Dr. Harrison Webb, who has a hospital wing named after him, who was one of Charleston's most respected citizens, was running a criminal organization that stole babies from black mothers and sold them to white families." "I'm not alleging anything," Margaret said quietly. "I'm showing you documentary evidence. The birth certificates and hospital records match perfectly in timing and location, but list different races and incompatible information. The financial records show unexplained payments to Webb's private organization. The testimony confirms what the documents suggest. Babies were taken and mothers were told lies." Griffin leaned back in his chair. "How many cases are you talking about?" 207 that I've been able to document. There may be more that I haven't found yet." 207. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Miss Hayes, do you understand what you're telling me? I understand that crimes were committed, serious crimes, and I believe they should be investigated and prosecuted." "Investigated and prosecuted." Griffin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The people who committed these alleged crimes, assuming your interpretation is correct, are either dead or have been respected members of Charleston society for decades. The adoptive families are some of the most powerful people in this city. The children involved are adults now, in their 30s and 40s, living their lives with no idea about any of this. So we just let it go? We pretend it didn't happen? I'm saying you need to think about the practical realities." Griffin stood and walked to his window, looking out at Broad Street below. "Let's say you're absolutely correct. Let's say Dr. Webb and others were systematically stealing light-skinned black babies and selling them to wealthy white families. Let's say you have ironclad proof. I have strong evidence. Even with ironclad proof, what happens when you expose this?" He turned to face her. "The adoptees, the babies who are now adults, would learn that their entire identity is a lie, that they're not biologically related to the families that raised them, that they were stolen as infants. Their lives would be destroyed. Their lives are already built on lies. Yes, but they don't know that. Right now they're living normal lives. They have families, careers, identities. You'd be taking all of that away." Griffin returned to his desk. "And what about the mothers? You said you interviewed some of them. They spent 20 or 30 years trying to move past their trauma. Reopening this would force them to relive the worst moments of their lives, knowing that their children are alive somewhere, but that reunification is probably impossible. They deserve to know the truth. Maybe. But would the truth make their lives better or worse?" Griffin sat down. "And then there are the adoptive families. Some probably had no idea the adoptions were fraudulent. They went through what they thought were legitimate agencies, paid what they thought were legitimate fees, and genuinely believed they were giving homes to orphans. You'd be destroying their families too." "Some of them must have known," Margaret insisted. "The fees were too high, the process was too quick. The lack of background information was too suspicious. Some of them had to know they were buying stolen babies. Perhaps, but proving that 3 decades later would be nearly impossible. The people who would have known the truth, Webb, whoever else organized this, they're dead. You can't prosecute dead people." Griffin folded his hands on his desk. "Miss Hayes, I appreciate your dedication to justice, But you need to consider whether exposing this would create more harm than good. So your advice is to cover it up? To let them get away with it? My advice is to think carefully about your motivations and your goals. If your goal is justice, you need to ask, justice for whom? If your goal is truth, you need to ask, at what cost? He pushed the folder back toward her. The people who organized this operation, they're beyond justice now. The victims have already suffered. The only people who would be hurt by exposure are the living, the adoptees who'd learn devastating truths, the biological mothers who'd have old wounds reopened, the adoptive families who'd face scandal and shame. Margaret stood, gathering her documents. I understand your position, Mr. Griffin, but I disagree. The truth matters. These crimes matter. The victims deserve acknowledgement, even if acknowledgement causes them more pain. Even then, because the alternative is letting the powerful get away with exploiting the powerless. The alternative is saying that some crimes are okay as long as enough time passes and enough important people benefit. Griffin sighed. Ms. Hayes, I respect your principles, but I can't help you with this. I won't be part of exposing something that would cause this much collateral damage. Margaret left his office feeling hollowed out. She'd expected skepticism, perhaps. She'd expected practical concerns about proof and prosecutability. She hadn't expected a lawyer to essentially tell her that the truth was too dangerous to reveal. But maybe he was right. Maybe exposing this would only create more victims. Maybe the moral thing to do was let the past stay buried. She spent the weekend thinking about it, smoking cigarettes on her small apartment's balcony and staring at Charleston's skyline. She thought about the mothers she'd interviewed, the pain still fresh in their voices decades later. She thought about the stolen children, now adults, living comfortable lives built on lies. She thought about Dr. Webb's legacy, untarnished despite his crimes. On Monday morning, she made her decision. Truth mattered. Justice mattered. Even if it was messy, even if it hurt people, even if it was complicated, she would expose what she'd found. Margaret spent 2 weeks preparing a comprehensive report. 53 pages, single-spaced, documenting every matched case, every interview, every financial record she'd traced. She included photocopies of key documents, sworn statements from the mothers she'd interviewed, timelines showing the operation's scope and duration, analysis of the institutional systems that had enabled the trafficking. It was thorough. It was compelling. It was damning. She made 3 copies. One went into her locked desk drawer at work. One went into her home safe, hidden behind winter coats in her bedroom closet. The third she mailed to the Charleston Post, addressed to the editor with a cover letter explaining what the documents contained and requesting investigation. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Margaret went to work, continued her archival duties, tried to act normal. The report she'd mailed sat in her locked drawer, a secret bomb waiting to explode. Then, on a Tuesday morning in mid-August, her supervisor called her into his office. Howard Brennan's office was on the 2nd floor of the county administration building, with windows overlooking the street and certificates of appreciation covering one wall. Normally, Brennan was jovial, quick with jokes, always friendly, the kind of boss who remembered birthdays and asked about employees' families. But when Margaret entered his office that morning, his face was grave. Margaret, please sit down. She sat, her heart beginning to race. This wasn't normal. Something had happened. I've been informed that you've been accessing records outside your assigned archival duties, Brennan said without preamble. His voice was formal, careful. Hospital records, financial documents, adoption files, records that aren't part of the county archives project you were hired to manage. Margaret's mouth went dry. Everything I've accessed has been properly catalogued and organized. That's my job. Your job is to organize county records, not to conduct criminal investigations. He pulled out a folder, much thicker than the one she'd shown Griffin. You've been pulling specific files that follow a pattern. You've been making copies of documents. You've been taking notes that have nothing to do with archival work. Someone had been watching her. Someone had been monitoring which files she accessed, what patterns she followed. Someone had reported her activities to her supervisor. "I found evidence of crimes in the records," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was my duty to—" "Your duty is to organize and catalog, not to make accusations against prominent Charleston families based on circumstantial connections between old records." Brennan's voice hardened. "Thomas Griffin called me last week. He was concerned about your zealousness. He thought I should know you were making serious allegations based on incomplete information." Of course. Griffin had reported her. The lawyer she'd trusted with the truth had gone directly to the county administration. "The documents aren't incomplete," Margaret said. "The patterns are clear. Birth certificates and hospital records that match in every detail except race. Financial payments with no legitimate explanation. Testimony from mothers who... Testimony from elderly women whose memories of traumatic events from 30 years ago may not be reliable. Documentary matches that could be explained by clerical errors or administrative confusion. Financial records that have perfectly legitimate explanations. The Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau did charitable work. It received charitable donations and government contracts." Brennan leaned forward. "Margaret, you've constructed a conspiracy theory from archival fragments and convinced yourself it's fact." "It is fact, Doctor. Webb was stealing babies from black mothers and selling them to white families. The evidence is..." Dr. Harrison Webb was one of Charleston's most respected citizens. He improved the lives of countless children. He established pediatric health programs that are still operating today. He was a good man who dedicated his life to helping children. Brennan's tone allowed no argument. "Your allegations against him are outrageous and unfounded. The allegations aren't against a person, they're about a system. Multiple institutions working together to..." "Margaret," Brennan stood. "Your employment with Charleston County is terminated, effective immediately. You will be paid through the end of the month. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings." The words hit like physical blows. "You're firing me. You've been conducting unauthorized investigations, accessing confidential records outside your job scope, making defamatory allegations against deceased citizens and prominent families, and generally abusing your position of trust." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Margaret. You seem like a decent person, but you've crossed lines that can't be ignored. I was trying to expose crimes. You were seeing patterns where none exist and causing potential harm to innocent people based on flawed interpretations of old paperwork." He moved toward the door. "Take my advice. Let this go. Find another job. Start fresh somewhere else. Stop chasing shadows." 2 security guards were waiting outside Brennan's office. They weren't aggressive or threatening, just quietly professional as they escorted Margaret back to the basement records room. They watched as she packed her personal items into a cardboard box. Her notepad, her fountain pen, a photo of her parents, a coffee mug her sister had given her. When she reached for her locked desk drawer, one of the guards gently stopped her. "Anything in locked desk drawers is county property, ma'am," he said. His voice was polite but firm. "It'll be inventoried and sent to you if it's personal. Her research, all her documentation. The evidence she'd spent 4 months compiling. The matched records, the interview notes, the financial trails, the copied documents. Everything except the copies she'd hidden at home and the report she'd mailed to the newspaper. That's my personal research," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Notes I took during my lunch breaks. It's not county property. If it's in county furniture, created using county resources during your employment, it's county property. We'll go through it and return anything personal." The guard's expression was sympathetic but unyielding. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're just following procedure." They walked her out of the building she'd worked in for 5 months. It was barely 10 in the morning, bright summer sunlight making her blink after hours in the dim basement. Other county employees watched as she was escorted out, their faces carefully neutral. Margaret stood on the sidewalk holding her cardboard box of personal items and feeling untethered from reality. She'd been fired. Her research had been confiscated. The lawyer she'd approached had betrayed her, And somewhere in Charleston, the people who'd benefited from Dr. Webb's operation were breathing sighs of relief that the threat had been neutralized. That evening, Margaret called the Charleston Post and asked to speak to someone about the report she'd mailed 2.5 weeks earlier. The receptionist was polite and confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't see any record of receiving a report from you. What did it concern?" Margaret described her 53-page document in detail. The title page, the documentation of baby trafficking, the evidence against Dr. Harrison Webb and Charleston's institutions. "No, we definitely haven't received anything like that," the receptionist said. "Our mailroom is very thorough. If we'd gotten something that substantial, it would have been logged and assigned to a reporter." "Can you describe the envelope? When did you mail it?" Margaret provided the details. The receptionist promised to check with the mailroom and call back if anything turned up. No one called back. The report she'd carefully compiled and mailed had vanished somewhere between her mailbox and the newspaper's offices. Or it had arrived and been disappeared before it could reach anyone who might have investigated. Margaret sat in her apartment that night, smoking cigarettes and staring at the phone, paralyzed by the scope of the cover-up she'd stumbled into. They'd taken her job, her research, her attempt to contact the press. Someone with power had decided this story couldn't come out, and they had the resources to make sure it stayed buried. She still had one copy of the report hidden at home. She still had her notes. She could try other newspapers, Columbia, Atlanta, even papers outside the South. Someone might listen. Someone might care. But Griffin's words echoed in her mind. Who benefits from exposing this? The mothers had already suffered. The children were adults living comfortable lives. The perpetrators were dead or untouchable. Exposing the truth would create new victims without bringing justice to old ones. Maybe that's what they were counting on. Maybe that's how they'd gotten away with it for so long. The truth was so ugly, so damaging, so complicated, that exposing it seemed crueler than maintaining the lies. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret sent her report to the Columbia State newspaper, the Charlotte Observer, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She sent it to the FBI field office in Columbia. She sent it to the NAACP headquarters in New York. She received exactly 2 responses. The Columbia State sent a polite letter thanking her for the information and explaining that they couldn't pursue investigations of events that occurred in other jurisdictions decades ago. The NAACP sent a letter expressing appreciation for her documentation and assuring her that the matter would be reviewed. Nothing came of either response. No reporters called, no investigators followed up. The story she'd tried to expose simply sank without a ripple. In September, Margaret moved to Atlanta. Charleston held nothing for her anymore. No job, no friends, no future. She found work as a secretary at a law firm, got a small apartment in Buckhead, tried to build a new life. But she never forgot what she'd found in Charleston's basement archives. She kept her copy of the report hidden, locked away but preserved. Just in case. Just in case someday the world was ready to hear the truth. Years passed. Margaret married in 1953, a decent man named Robert Collins, who worked as an accountant and never asked too many questions about why his wife sometimes woke from nightmares about babies and lies. She had 2 children, a daughter and a son, and raised them in comfortable suburban normalcy. But she never stopped following news from Charleston. She watched for any hint that someone else had discovered what she'd found, that the truth might finally come out. In 1968, during the height of the civil rights movement, everything changed. An investigative journalist named Patricia Reynolds published a major piece in the New York Times about forced sterilizations and adoption coercion targeting black women across the South. The article detailed how hospitals, social workers, and adoption agencies had systematically pressured poor black women into giving up their babies, often through coercion or outright theft. It was explosive, prompting investigations in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and North Carolina. Margaret, now Margaret Collins and living in suburban Atlanta, read the article with tears streaming down her face. Someone was finally taking these stories seriously. Someone was finally willing to expose how institutions had exploited vulnerable mothers. She went to her closet and pulled down the lockbox she hadn't opened in 17 years. Inside was her copy of the 53-page report, slightly yellowed but still readable. She also had her interview notes, her matched document sets, her timeline of Dr. Webb's operation. She mailed everything to Patricia Reynolds with a detailed cover letter explaining what she'd found, what had happened when she tried to report it, and why she believed Charleston's stolen children deserved investigation. Reynolds called her 3 days later, her voice crackling with excitement over long distance. "Mrs. Collins, this is extraordinary. You documented an entire trafficking operation, and you've been sitting on this since 1951. I tried to report it," Margaret said. "No one would listen. I lost my job. My evidence was confiscated. I sent it to newspapers and got no response. Eventually, I just gave up. Times are different now. People are ready to hear these stories. We're not accepting institutional claims of benevolence at face value anymore." Reynolds paused. "Would you be willing to go on record? Would you let me cite you as a source?" Margaret thought about Evelyn Porter's brother, about Clara Williams's fierce anger, about all the mothers who'd been silenced and dismissed. She thought about Dr. Harrison Webb's untarnished legacy, about the wealthy families still living comfortable lives, about the stolen children who'd never known the truth. "Yes," she said, "I'll go on record. Use my name. Tell the story." Patricia Reynolds spent 4 months investigating Margaret's claims. She traveled to Charleston, reviewed public records that Margaret had documented, tracked down some of the now elderly mothers for interviews. She found additional cases that Margaret had missed, traced financial payments through more recent records, confirmed the connections between Dr. Webb, St. Catherine's, and the Charleston Foundling Home. She discovered that St. Catherine's Adoption Society was still operating, still facilitating adoptions, still sealing records. She discovered that Dr. Webb's legacy was still celebrated. The pediatric wing named for him, a scholarship in his name, an annual medical award honoring his contributions to child welfare. Reynolds' investigation confirmed everything Margaret had documented and added new layers of detail. The scope was even larger than Margaret had realized. Reynolds found evidence suggesting the operation had continued in modified form even after Webb's death, run by his associates until the early 1950s. The story was scheduled to run in the New York Times in March 1969. It would be front-page news, a bombshell investigation that would expose decades of systematic child trafficking hidden behind Charleston's respectable institutions. Reynolds had titled it "Charleston's Stolen Children: How a Trafficking Ring Operated in Plain Sight." 3 weeks before publication, Patricia Reynolds died. Her car went off a bridge during a rainstorm in rural South Carolina. She'd been driving back to Columbia after interviewing sources in Charleston. The bridge was narrow, the road was slick, and investigators determined she'd simply lost control on a curve. The circumstances were ruled accidental. Single vehicle accident, no suspicious circumstances, tragic but straightforward. Her investigation notes were never found. Her editors at the time said they had some preliminary drafts, but nothing complete enough to publish. The story died with her. Margaret received a call from a Times editor expressing condolences and explaining that without Reynolds's notes and completed draft, they couldn't run the story. Would Margaret be willing to work with another journalist to restart the investigation? Margaret said yes. She waited. No other journalist called. She wrote to the Times 6 months later, asking about the status of the investigation. She received a polite response explaining that they'd decided not to pursue the story further. After Reynolds's death, they'd encountered difficulties obtaining cooperation from Charleston authorities, and without access to complete documentation, they felt they couldn't meet their editorial standards for such a serious allegation. Margaret understood what that meant. Someone had intervened. Someone had made sure Patricia Reynolds's investigation disappeared along with her life. She wondered if the car accident had really been an accident. The thought kept her awake at night, made her jump at unexpected sounds, made her paranoid about her own safety. But nothing happened to her. No one threatened her. No one seemed interested in Margaret Collins, suburban Atlanta housewife. She was no longer dangerous, just a woman with a box of old papers that no one wanted to read. In 1974, Margaret was diagnosed with breast cancer. Facing her own mortality, she tried one more time to expose what she'd found. She sent her documentation to the Department of Health, Education and Welfare. She sent it to the Southern Poverty Law Center. She sent it to the NAACP again, this time with a personal letter to the director explaining everything she knew. She received polite responses thanking her for the information and assuring her that the matter would be reviewed. No investigations materialized. No reporters followed up. No one seemed to care about crimes that had happened decades ago to people who had no power. Margaret Collins died in November 1976, 4 days after her 53rd birthday. The cancer had spread faster than doctors expected. At her funeral, her husband and children mourned a woman they'd known as a devoted mother and wife, but whose obsession with Charleston's secrets had always remained slightly mysterious to them. Her papers, boxes of documents about stolen babies and trafficking rings, were packed up by her children and stored in the attic of their father's house. They didn't throw the papers away. Their mother had clearly considered them important. But they didn't read them either. It was just old paperwork, historical records, nothing that seemed relevant to their lives in the late 1970s. The boxes sat in that attic for 43 years, slowly gathering dust, surviving moves and house cleanings through sheer inertia. Margaret's children grew up, had children of their own, eventually grew old themselves. In 2019, Margaret's granddaughter Amanda was cleaning out her late father's house. Margaret's son had died at 75, and the family was preparing to sell the property. In the attic, Amanda found the boxes her grandmother had left behind. Curious about her grandmother's papers, she opened them. By the time she finished reading the first 20 pages of Margaret's 53-page report, she was shaking. Amanda was a graduate student in social work at Emory University, specializing in family services and adoption ethics. She had access to academic databases, genealogical research tools, and DNA testing resources that her grandmother could never have imagined in 1951. She digitized everything, every document, every interview note, every timeline. She began cross-referencing names with modern genealogical records, tracing what had happened to the families involved. She used DNA ancestry databases to identify potential biological connections between Charleston families. She discovered that many of the stolen babies Margaret had documented were still alive. Elderly now, in their 80s and 90s, but alive. Some had died, but they'd left descendants. She found Clara Williams's granddaughter, a civil rights lawyer in Washington, D.C. She found descendants of other mothers, families who'd passed down stories of stolen babies that had been dismissed as folklore or grief-induced delusions. She compiled everything into a comprehensive academic paper titled Racial Passing and Child Trafficking in Charleston, South Carolina, 1922-1940, a case study in institutional exploitation. She submitted it to the Journal of African American History. While it was under peer review, she also created a website documenting her grandmother's findings, including scanned images of the matched documents and excerpts from the interview notes. She posted it online with a simple title, Charleston's Stolen Children. The Truth. Margaret Hayes Tried to Tell. The website went viral within 48 hours. Major newspapers picked up the story within a week. The Charleston Post, which had never received or had disappeared Margaret's original report, ran a front-page article about the allegations. National news outlets sent reporters to Charleston to investigate. DNA testing companies offered free kits to anyone who suspected they might be one of the stolen children. The story exploded in ways that would have been impossible in 1951 or even 1969. Social media amplified it. DNA testing technology made verification possible. The cultural climate of 2019 was ready to confront institutional racism and historical injustices in ways that earlier eras had refused. Within 3 months, St. Catherine's Adoption Society, still operating under new management and now called Carolina Family Services, was forced by court order to open its sealed adoption records from the 1920s through 1940s. The files confirmed everything Margaret had documented and revealed even more cases she'd missed. DNA testing confirmed biological relationships that matched Margaret's documented cases. Adoptees who'd lived their entire lives believing they were white learned they had African-American biological mothers. Families were shattered and rebuilt simultaneously. Truth emerged in all its complicated, painful glory. The final verified count was 214. 214 light-skinned black babies systematically stolen from their mothers and sold to wealthy white families between 1922 and 1940. Each one documented as European on falsified birth certificates, each one severing a black mother's connection to her child. Dr. Harrison Webb's name was removed from the pediatric wing at Charleston County Hospital. His scholarship was discontinued. His annual award was renamed. His legacy was finally corrected to reflect the truth. He'd been a monster who'd used his medical authority to exploit vulnerable women and traffic their children for profit. The mothers who were still alive finally had validation. Clara Williams's daughter spoke at a public forum in Charleston, reading from her mother's journals about the baby that had been stolen. Evelyn Porter's great-niece stood at a memorial ceremony and spoke about how Evelyn had died, still wondering if her baby had really been dead or if the doctors had lied. The adoptees faced the most difficult revelations. Some sought out biological relatives and found connection and healing. Others rejected the information entirely, choosing to believe they were who they'd always thought they were rather than accepting the truth. Some fell into profound identity crises, unsure of who they were anymore. Lawsuits were filed against the hospital, against Carolina Family Services, formerly St. Catherine's, against the estates of families who'd knowingly purchased stolen babies. Most were settled quietly, with substantial payments made to biological families and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. A few went to trial, resulting in public exposure of documents that confirmed the systematic nature of the trafficking. No criminal charges were filed. Everyone directly responsible was long dead. The institutions involved issued formal apologies, established funds to compensate victims' families, and promised to ensure nothing similar could happen again. In 2021, Charleston erected a memorial to the mothers who'd lost children to Dr. Webb's trafficking scheme. It's a simple granite stone in a small park near the old hospital building, inscribed with the names of mothers who could be verified and a dedication to those whose names were lost or never recorded. Margaret Hayes's name is listed on the memorial, not as a victim but as a witness. The plaque describes her as the archivist who tried to tell the truth when no one wanted to hear it. Amanda Collins, Margaret's granddaughter, spoke at the memorial's dedication ceremony. She talked about finding her grandmother's papers in an attic, about realizing that Margaret had tried for decades to expose these crimes but had been systematically silenced. She talked about how truth demands persistence, how justice requires people willing to speak even when it costs them everything. My grandmother lost her job, her reputation, her attempts to pursue justice, Amanda said to the crowd gathered in the small park. She died believing she'd failed, but she didn't fail. She documented the truth. She preserved the evidence. She refused to let these crimes be completely erased. And nearly 70 years after she first tried to tell this story, the world is finally listening. The last living person confirmed to have been one of the stolen children, a man named Robert Hartwell, died in 2023 at 96. He'd lived his entire life believing he was the biological son of a prominent Charleston banking family. He'd learned the truth about his origins in 2020 at age 93. Through DNA testing prompted by Amanda's investigation. His biological mother had been a 16-year-old girl named Alice Hayes, no relation to Margaret, who'd been told her baby died during delivery. Alice had spent 74 years wondering if the doctors had lied to her. She'd died in 1994, never knowing for certain. When Robert learned his true history, he legally changed his name to Robert Hayes, taking his biological mother's maiden name. He spent his final 3 years connecting with biological relatives, reconstructing Alice's story, trying to honor the mother who'd never stopped grieving for him. "I lived a good life," he said in an interview 6 months before his death. "I had parents who loved me, opportunities I'm grateful for, success by any reasonable measure. But it was all built on a lie, on theft, on my mother's grief." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "If I could go back, if I could choose, I'd rather have grown up poor with my real mother than wealthy with a stolen identity. But I didn't get that choice. None of us did. Dr. Webb and his network made those choices for us, and they chose profit over humanity." The records that Margaret Hayes discovered in the Charleston County basement in 1951 still exist. They're now digitized and available to researchers through the Charleston Historical Society, no longer hidden in storage rooms, no longer protected by powerful people who prefer darkness to truth. Historians use them to study how institutional racism operated in practice. Social workers use them to understand historical adoption abuses. Law students study them as case examples of systematic exploitation that went unpunished for decades. The story of Charleston's stolen children is taught now in social work programs as a case study in racial injustice and institutional exploitation. It's cited in bioethics discussions about medical authority and vulnerable populations. It's referenced in adoption law reform proposals. Academic conferences hold panels discussing the case and its implications. But in 1951, when Margaret Hayes tried to tell the truth, the only thing anyone wanted was silence. She didn't give them silence. Even when it cost her everything, even when her evidence was confiscated and her reports were disappeared and her warnings were ignored, even when people told her the truth was too dangerous to reveal, she didn't stay quiet. She documented everything she found. She preserved the evidence. She kept trying to make someone listen. The truth was buried for nearly 70 years, but it wasn't destroyed. It couldn't be destroyed because Margaret Hayes had refused to let it disappear completely. Sometimes that has to be enough. Sometimes all you can do is preserve the truth and hope that someday someone will be ready to hear it. Margaret never lived to see justice for Charleston's stolen children, but she made that justice possible. Her documentation, her interviews, her persistence, all of it eventually led to exposure, acknowledgement, and at least partial redress. History remembers Dr. Harrison Webb now as a trafficker who exploited his position and betrayed his oath. History remembers St. Catherine's Adoption Society as a front for child theft. History remembers Charleston's institutions as complicit in systematic exploitation. And history remembers Margaret Hayes as the woman who refused to look away. The mothers are gone now. The stolen children are gone or very elderly. The traffickers are gone. All that remains are documents, testimony, memorials, and the uncomfortable knowledge that institutional evil can operate openly for decades if the victims are powerless and the perpetrators are respectable enough. But there's something else that remains. Proof that the truth, even when buried, can eventually emerge. Proof that documentation matters, that persistence matters, that refusing to stay silent matters even when silence seems easier and safer. Margaret Hayes couldn't have known, as she packed her cardboard box and was escorted out of the Charleston County building in 1951, that her work would eventually matter. She couldn't have known that the papers she hid in her closet would one day be found by her granddaughter and transformed into the evidence that finally broke the silence. She died believing she'd failed, but she hadn't failed. She'd just planted seeds that took 70 years to bloom. And maybe that's the real lesson of Charleston's stolen children. That speaking truth to power, even when it seems futile, even when you're silenced and dismissed and punished for it, still matters. The truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient or dangerous. It waits, and sometimes, if someone is brave enough to preserve it, the truth eventually finds its moment. Margaret Hayes gave the truth that chance. Everything that came after, the exposure, the acknowledgement, the memorial, the justice, all of it began in a basement records room in 1951 with one archivist who noticed patterns in old papers and refused to pretend she hadn't seen them.